Dzień dobry, miło mi Państwa powitać na
Good
sesji.
evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to an educational session organized by the International Center for Education on Holocaust and Auschwitz. My name is Mario Martyniak and I coordinate the meeting today. I'd like to thank you for your decision to spend this time with us and with the guests we have invited for you. The subject is connected to the establishment of the so-called Zigeunerlager, the gypsy family camp in KL Auschwitz. The Nazi ideology recognized them enemies of the Third Reich, therefore they were sentenced to isolation and destruction, the Porajmos, in February 1941. Their deportations started. During the session, we will discuss the origin and the successive steps of persecution of the Roman people during the Second World War, the history of the family camp, and also social contexts. The session is interpreted live into English, and it will last until around 6:30 p.m. Central European Time. We have with us Professor Sławomir Kapralski, the head of the Chair of Cultural Sociology at the University of Pedagogics in Cracow, Chair of Research Projects and author of numerous research on the Roma people. He will lecture today about the persecution of the Roma in the Third Reich, but also in the occupied countries. Good afternoon, Professor, and the floor goes to you. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd like to thank you for coming in such great numbers. At the moment, I will start sharing my screen with you to show you my presentation, and I will also ask you to confirm whether everything works fine and we can see everything. Let's get down to our page 1. Can you see the slides I'm sharing? Yes, Professor, we can see your slides. So, ladies and gentlemen, to use my 45 minutes to discuss the murder of the Roma during the Second World War, you would have to be a master of ancient Chinese poetry. They use several words to describe the mysteries of the world, but I'll try to give you a broad brush picture. My problem is that to understand what happened with the Roma during the Second World War, we have to retrace our steps very deep in time. For a simple reason, the roots of the destruction of the Roma, of the mass murder of the Roma during the Second World War, are part of this great transformation of the European society that resulted in the establishment of the so-called modern society, and that took place from the 17th century. It lasted until the 19th. The Roma arrived in Western Europe in the 15th century, more or less, and the Romani people would settle in different countries, and thus the Roma and Sinti were looking for their place on the earth. And we are going to deal with the Romani people in Western Europe, where the roots of that program are vested. That program started to be implemented in the 20th century. Western and Eastern Europe didn't much like the Romani either. But it was not the Eastern Europe that invented the genocide of the Roma and the Sinti. And Eastern Europe was simply not that affluent, and the Romani people, Roma, Sinti, and others could find their place there. There were more of those who are settled, only some were still migrant. They didn't have that place in the Western Europe. When they arrived in Western Europe, the traditional society was really breathing its last. That was a society that, at least to an extent, accepted the Romani people, and they had those niches, the economic niches, where they could deal with their trades, with the tools, and in that role they were basically recognized as ones who could stay. Naturally, there were many cruel and bloody anti-Romani pogroms, but they were spontaneous and they were quite local. You could at least escape by just moving several kilometers, several dozens of kilometers perhaps, settling somewhere else. Well, at the moment of the transformations that resulted in the establishment of a modern society just happened. European colonialism played a very important role here. Now we are discovering the great role that the colonial expansion played here. We only now realize what the attitude of European colonial powers to their own minorities, to their own peoples was. We will say that the process of modernization in Europe and the colonial expansion and their social and cultural aftermath was such a lethal coincidence that made a horrible impact on the Roma and on their fate. What was the essence of that impact then? Well, first of all, the Roma began to be at the target of state authorities. The persecution of the Roma began to be state organized, and as such, those persecutions aimed primarily at the way of life of the Western societies of the Romani in Western Europe. Well, it simply did not fit that framework because the Roma, who were not accepted in the general society when they arrived in Europe, worked out their own methods that served their survival to function in between, on the margin of the social life of the established economy, in their own economic niches. And when suddenly the state forced them to reject all those and to become employees, workers in all the new plants and factories that were developing there in result of the process of industrialization, they simply did not agree to that, as they had their own way of life and they would guard it, they would defend it. Now the modern society assumes that there is a need for homogenization, as we call it. That's a unification of the social group. It won't allow differences, for which reason the walk of life and the way that the Romani lived was just a problem for everyone. On top of that came the Nazi ideology. And a discovery of later years is that it was a product of colonial expansion. It is not so that racism developed in Europe, and that was why Europeans began to colonize other peoples. It was the other way around. It was the colonial expansion that began to call for justification. And then racism was invented, racism that began to play a profound role also in Europe. The groups that differed in their style of life from the ideal that the powers that be wanted to propose were, in inverted commas, explained by some biological separateness, difference. That was when West European universities developed the chairs of eugenics, where biological racism was being developed, just to justify that any Romani or Sinti is biologically a different human, that they belong to a different race. That had profound consequence for the Roma and Sinti, because initially the program of modernization of the society assumed that everyone will be assimilated. So particular holistic programs of forced assimilation of the Roma were introduced. The Habsburgs did it, whether in Austro-Hungarian Empire or in Spain. These were really broadside assimilation programs. Once racism developed, those programs were given up, also because they were misdesigned in terms of economics. Well, the racist conviction that a Romani is a Romani by the biological nature, and nature cannot be changed through any impact, any educational steps or practices, for which reason you simply had to stop any attempts here. And actually, by the end of the 19th century, Roma in Europe were not much persecuted. However, late in the 19th century, those persecutions, highly organized, began. I will return to that. We must remember that persecution of the Roma started long before Hitler's coming to power, and that persecution was profoundly rooted in our modern European culture we are so proud of. That is why it was so hard and difficult to admit to such persecution. Even back in the 1970s, sociological research in the Federal Republic of Germany proved that a decided majority of the society believed that the Shoah, the Holocaust of the Jews, was a very bad thing. The same society, however, believed that what was done to the Roma during the Second World War might have been cruel, yet it was by all means justified. Even in the latter half of the 70s, Germans believed that sending the Romani people, the Roma and Sinti, to Auschwitz was justified. It is very hard to admit to something that cannot be blamed on Hitler and the so-called Nazi. It is very hard to admit that that murderous impulse to kill off the Roma is vested profoundly and deeply in our West European civilization we are so proud of. This is a very simple way of presenting how modernization and colonization made their impact on the situation of the Roma through various factors. Modernization, that's industrialization, homogenization, secularization, control, and discipline. Colonialism made its impact through racist concepts of segregation, but also genocide. All that had been practiced in the colonies. If we take a look at the policy of German colonial authorities in today's Namibia, that's southwestern Africa, we will easily see that you had all the elements of the genocide that Germans perpetrated later during the Second World War. I also mentioned here what the current historiography calls the effect of a boomerang, of the boomerang effect, which was the impact of the colonial experience on the situation of Europe. If we threw a boomerang from Europe, the tendency to expand, the boomerang returned to us. And for that reason, we began to use this expansion towards our own minorities. In result, what we are dealing with is nationalization of Romani economic niches, tightened control, and a stereotype of Romani pathology is developing, which causes a negative attitude of the society to the Romani. First, there's the policy of forced assimilation. However, later, under the impact of racist ideology, that policy is rejected, there are rather tendencies to bring the Romani beyond the margin of the society, and finally, to exterminate them. One may ask a question, why the Romani became the target? We must remember that the Romani were, and the Sinti, the Roma and the Sinti were really a real minority. They did not matter in terms of numbers. You could let them live, even if all the stereotypic charges leveled against them were true. They would never have done much harm to the society. And yet, most of the accusations were false and based on a stereotype. Nevertheless, it turned out that suddenly those Roma grew to a rank of a huge and horrible problem. Well, in the Nazi Germany, I believe there were more people who professionally dealt with the so-called Romani question than there were Roma in Germany. All the state administration were involved, special groups of the police, also special institutions of so-called welfare and welfare assistance. All that makes an impression of an irrational effort to eliminate one specific group that did not really do much harm to anyone. To explain all those, some academics invented the concept of so-called replacement victims. Now, the repressions against the Roma were to be a warning for everyone. If you're not cynical, you will be met with the fate that the Roma are experiencing. Arjun Apaturai emphasizes that such a policy was frequently present in the countries that aimed at an ideology-defined perfection, like the Third Reich or the communist Soviet Union. If we aim for perfection, then even the smallest obstacle means that we cannot achieve that perfection, for which reason even the least obstacles are ruthlessly eliminated. And then this elimination of the so-called obstacles was very slow. It was introduced gradually. It started from documentation and registration. The Roma in Western Europe began to be monitored by a special range of institutions. They had their data collected and identity cards were issued to them. They were the first group in Europe who were obliged to carry on them IDs with a photograph to prove their identity. Here, the iconography I'm sharing offers you such a Hungarian document with fingerprints. A lot of data were collected. At the same time, there was reinforced police control of what the Romani did. Here in the photo, we can see an Austrian policeman, and that Austrian policeman is taking a list of the Romani tools. Those two gentlemen in the hats are sharpened knives and other tools in Austria. Any economic activity of the Roma was very carefully regulated. A fragment of such regulations is quoted here in this slide, and those regulations proved that the Roma could never be sure whether they can do something or can't do something. They had to have a whole lot of certificates, and often in the case of people who didn't know how to write, it was easy to have some errors in those documents, which was very quickly exploited by the police, who immediately punished them, made them pay fines, and of course recorded all that in proper documents. in that process, they created conditions that made you hard to not to commit any crime. And in this way, many actions of the Roma became criminalized, and many Romani people had that stamp in their papers that they were punished for this or for that. That was very important when those documents became the grounds for certain racial measures. That was all in the eye of law. In 1926, Germany promulgated a special law for the fight against gypsies, vagrants, and the work shy. So they were a part of a group that had a certain law against them, defining a range of repressions that you could apply against them. In 1933, there were new laws introduced for preventive fight against crime. So if you were a habitual criminal, already at the time defined as an asocial individual, you could detain them. Who were they? Well, the Roma who had any thing in their papers. They were considered habitual criminals, and then they could be detained when the authorities said that a certain number of the Roma must be arrested to prove that the law is obeyed. In the same year, the law to prevent genetic transmission of illnesses was introduced, which made possible forced sterilization of the Roma who had any conflict with the law, because asocial behaviors were considered the proof of the hidden moral and intellectual debilitation. An official illness that was allegedly genetically based and was diagnosed by German physicians and psychologists through knowledge tests. Not even intelligence, but knowledge was tested in those. Finally, 1935, the Nuremberg laws. The Roma were not mentioned in them directly. However, they were covered by various decrees and bylaws. They could not marry the so-called racially pure Germans, nor could they participate in elections. And the following version from 1943 stripped the Roma and Sinti of Germany to the right of being citizens of the Reich. And that had consequences after the Second World War, as many of them had to prove that they had lived in that country prior to the Second World War. So we can say that on the power of the Nuremberg laws, the Roma and the Sinti were recognized citizens of a lower category, people of alien blood. The decree on fighting the Gypsy Plague, signed by Heinrich Himmler on 8 December 1938, was very important, as that clearly quoted the racist reasons for the persecution of the Roma. We read that the knowledge from biological study on the race, it is certain that the proper method for the final solution of the Gypsy question should be treating it as a racial problem. The word Endlösung, the final solution, comes here in the Nazi language code that mentions simply genocide. And we must say that in 1938, Germans still had no specific genocidal program. They didn't know what to do about the Roma. They knew they have to do something about them because they are people of worse race, but there were no developed genocidal plans yet, even if some individuals were dreaming up such plans. Those did not exist at the time. They didn't even exist during the Second World War. And many of the genocidal acts against the Roma and the Sinti were developed without any such plans being developed. I will say it at the closing.
The aim of this bylaw was to separate the Romani from the German nation in order to prevent the miscegenation, as well as to separate the pure Romani and Sinti from the mixed ones. We can see clearly that for Nazi clerks, there was a problem whether the Romani should be treated as a whole, or should certain differences be introduced. There was a fraction who believed that pure gypsies should be closed in a certain reserve and studied, because perhaps in a degenerated form, of course, but still maybe they keep certain forms of Aryan culture. Moreover, the pure gypsies, as they were called before, were not getting married to other peoples, non-Romani peoples, hence there was no risk of spreading their racial traits. Segregation policy that had its source in Himmler's decree of 1938. It laid a foundation for the so-called special municipal gypsy camps that were created before Hitler took over. Originally, these were just places for the migrant Romani to camp out on, but increasingly, they were looking more and more like camps that could easily be entered, but it was very difficult to leave. Not only migrant Romani were placed there, but also the ones that have been evicted from their flats. For instance, in Berlin, when the whole city was refurbished before the Olympics in 1936, exactly in that year, a huge camp was created in Marzamt. Now it's a district of Berlin, where people were evicted too, where the money were evicted too from their flats. Besides Romani, other people were evicted, like the ones who could not pay their rent, who were taken care of by social services. They were placed in such camps that were used as flats, such cars that were used as flats, which was very interesting because the authorities always blamed the Romani of the migrant style of life. And at the same time, such wagons, such cars were used to accommodate them. Later on, such camps were used for isolation. Moreover, they were centers from which the Romani people were deported to concentration camps and the extermination camps in the occupied Poland. At the same time, concentration camps were created where the Romani were present from the very beginning, for instance, in Dachau from July 1936. They were present in all concentration camps. In May 1939, 20% of female inmates in Ravensbrück were Austrian Romani. And on the photo, we can see a workshop where the Romani women were weaving baskets. And this is a moment when they are starting their work. New institutions were founded as well, like the Department of Racial Hygiene and Population Biology, for instance, that documented all Romani in Germany with a very precise information part, information on health, anthropometric data, kinship information, and so on. On the photo on the right side, we have the head of this department, Herbert Richter, who is taking a blood sample from a German Sinti woman. The aim of this institution was clear. Namely, they were supposed to study the roots of social processes in the area of biology and in the rights of inheritance in order to remove persons who were non-integrated and non-productive. This institute was also responsible for creation of the definition of who is Romani. They created a few definitions. One of them said that in order to be deemed to be a so-called gypsy mix, it's enough to have 1/8 of gypsy blood, as they called it, which means one Romani great-grandfather was enough, great-grandparent was enough. As a result, the KL Auschwitz had had a lot of people deported there who learned they were Romani according to Nazi definition only after the police knocked on their door. For instance, the soldiers of Wehrmacht were also sent there, who first were sent to have some holidays, and then they were arrested. And actually, they were wearing Wehrmacht uniforms in KL Auschwitz until they were told to remove them, because that gave rise to a certain confusion among the guards. When the Second World War started, the segregation program was changed into deportation program. They had this idea of deportation of the German Romani to the occupied Poland. And this program started more, and as a result of which, about 2,500 of German, Romani, and Sinti were deported to Jewish ghettos and labor camps, or under the supervision of gendarmerie in different places in Poland. This program was stopped later on as a result of resistance of German occupation authorities, who protested in Berlin that they have enough problems with Poles and that they should not be sent German, Romani people because of sufficient problems there. When the war with the Soviet Union started, the question of deportation didn't make any sense anymore, because they didn't know where to deport them finally. Should they be deported to the territory of occupied Poland or to the territories won from the Soviet Union? There were also Austrian Sinti, 5,000 of them, who were moved from concentration camps in Austria to a ghetto in Łódź in Poland. That was the initiative of Austrian Nazis, who had a very strong anti-Romani program. And basically they were winning their support with this program before even Austria joined the Third Reich. In Łódź ghetto, among the deported Sinti, the epidemic of typhus broke out. Several hundred persons died, and the remaining ones were moved to Kulmhof camp, where they were murdered in trucks with exhaustion pipes connected to the part of the truck where people were kept. These were the first Romani victims of mass murder. Although officially this murder was justified by the epidemic, by the epidemic of typhus and the risk of spreading of typhus. A lot of mass murder was justified with the same argument, including mass murder in Auschwitz, until the final killing of the remaining inmates of the so-called Zigeunerlager, the family camp in Birkenau, who were killed without any justifications that would refer to typhus. Talking about Auschwitz, this is yet another stage of anti-Romani policy, from deportation to extermination. Heinrich Himmler, on 15th January 1943, declared the deportation of the Romani to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Similar bylaws pertained to, and similar decrees pertained to the Romani from Czechia, Slovakia, and other countries, the occupied territories of the Western Europe. The pure Romani were supposed to be separated from this group, but in fact, in reality, things work differently. The different committees, commissions were appointed who were deciding who is going to be sent to Auschwitz or not. And that was that local level where on which the decisions were taken. Sometimes we believe, speaking of the extermination, that everything works like in a German car, that there's Hitler on top, decisions are taken, and it's very precisely executed at lower levels. It was not the case. There was a lot of institutions of Nazi terror who were interfering with each other. There were certain conflicts of interest. The local authorities had a lot to say, and that was exactly the case of extermination of the Romani. In Birkenau, the so-called gypsy family camp, Zigeunerlager, was created in section B2E. The first transport arrived on 26th of February 1943. We will have an anniversary soon. In total, almost 23,000 persons were deported to Zigeuner Familienlager. There were more Romani in Auschwitz, although not all of them were registered as such. About 20,000 persons died of hunger, diseases, executions, medical experiments run by Mengele, and the inhuman conditions. The camp was liquidated, closed in 1944 on 16th of May. Sorry, in 1944 on the night, 2nd to 3rd of August. After the men who were able to work were sent to Germany, everyone who was left, the elderly, women and children, were killed in one night. According to the most recent research of historians from Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Museum, it was about 4,300 persons, more than we had expected before. There is one more thing related to it, namely there was a day of Romani resistance. Romani organizations commemorate an anniversary nowadays, every year, of the resistance organized by the Romani people in the gypsy family camp when it was supposed to be closed on the 16th of May. Most probably that date is not certain. The historians are not completely certain what was it about. Was it about deportation or closing off the camp? This whole history is known from the testimony of one person, and this testimony is present in 3 different versions. There are some inconsistencies between the versions. I am mentioning that in order to point out to a tiny problem, still significant, namely, on one hand, historical research, historical study is performed on the extermination of the Romani, and on the other hand, this extermination keeps functioning in the mass memory of the Romani people and activities of Romani organizations. And we do experience certain tensions between these two groups. And that's an example. The historians are not really convinced. Do we really know everything about this day, about this event? On the other hand, the Romani organizations are convinced that this was exactly the case. When it comes to other concentration camps, I already mentioned that the Romani were deported to Kulmhof, Treblinka. Well, quite a lot of Romani from Warsaw area were murdered starting in August 1942. Most probably the Romani were also deported to Auschwitz and Sobibor camps, but it's difficult to establish the number of people who were inmates there. Sometimes Romani were executed in concentration camps, in Buchenwald, in Ravensbrück, for instance. Besides Scale Auschwitz, a camp where most Romas, besides Scale Auschwitz, were killed was the camp Jasenovac. That camp was organized in Croatia, who cooperated with Hitler, whose government cooperated with Hitler under Ante Pavelic. It's difficult to establish what were the numbers of people murdered in Jasenovac because the documentation was not run there as precisely. Plus, people were murdered there not in a technical mass solutions, but using knives, sticks, in a very cruel way. It is expected or estimated that 16,000 Romani were killed there. Some historians believe it was as many as 25,000. The Romani from Germany, Austria, Czechia, Poland, partially, and Croatia were usually killed in the camps, murdered in the camps, while other Romani from other countries were murdered during mass executions that were, brutally speaking, more economic, because the Romani did not have to be transported to concentration camps. Moreover, frequently they would rebel, they would try to run away, they would refuse to be transported somewhere to the target place. Hence, it was decided that mass executions on site would be more economic. There were Einsatzgruppen, so-called Einsatzgruppen, established that were following the front line, and they were supposed to be murdering communists, Jews, and the Romani. When it comes to countries who collaborated with the Third Reich, well, the situation of the Romani there was different, was diversified. Nazi Germany allowed their allies certain free hand when it comes to decisions what to do with their Romani people. In Romania, an initial classification was performed where 40,000 Romani were deemed to be dangerous and unwanted, so they were deported to the area between Ukraine and current day Ukraine and Moldova. A lot of people died over there because of diseases, hunger. The work that was the labor that was too hard, and execution. At the same time, other Romani were conscripted to the army. At the same time, the risk of a conflict within the army brought this program to the end. Hence, in Romania, we have this case of a very interesting example of different ideas, because this war for the Romani in Romania, some of them were deported and murdered, while for others, it was a time of assimilation. So there's no uniformity when it comes to the memory. In Bulgaria, the Romani were not exterminated. They were forced to work, but they were not murdered. I'm talking about Bulgaria proper. However, on Bulgarian occupied territories, for instance, in Macedonia, the executions were commonplace. Similarly, Slovakia and Romania, they were not murdered up to a certain point. Only after Slovakian uprising, execution started. However, a small percentage of Slovakian and Romani were executed there. In Hungary, similarly, up to a certain point, the Hungarian regime who collaborated with Nazi Germany, but they were trying to not exterminate peoples. Only after 1944, after October 1944, anti-Romani persecution started. In the Western Europe, Romani were usually sent to internment camps. They were sent to these special internment camps, mostly in France and Italy. Only some of them were deported to Auschwitz against the order of Hitler. And Holland was quite unique. In Holland, in the Netherlands, there was not a lot of Romani living there, but about 250 persons were arrested and deported to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. How many Romani people were murdered? It's hard to say. We have problems with sources. Of course, we had to include the Romani murdered in mass executions out of concentration camps. There's no documentation. The literature says, quotes different numbers from 100,000 to 3 million. I also heard people saying that there were 4 million of Romani murdered. The official number says 500,000. Why? Mostly because politicians started to use this number because it's pretty round. Although even some historians believe it could have been 500,000 persons. The most careful historians say that perhaps 200,000 of victims is realistic. However, if we have a more qualitative approach, we will see that some Romani communities were almost completely murdered in Austria, Czechia, Croatia. Over there, there were no more Romani communities anymore. When it comes to Romani, to extermination, I'm coming to an end. So extermination of Romani did not give a feeling of something that was planned beforehand. Definitely, the Nazi Germans had this silent concern that the Romani are a lower race and they should be gotten rid of somehow. However, the actions taken were incoherent and dependent on a place and time. Different methods were used: sterilization, deportation, and extermination. Sterilization and extermination qualify as genocide. Direct genocide is used as well. There were 3 moments when most probably these extermination decisions were taken. That was the invasion of Nazi Germany on the Soviet Union in 1941, when orders to kill Romani were sent to special units, or Reinhardt action, that was the extermination of Polish Jews in 1942-43, when Romani were murdered, the Romani who had been deported to Poland before, as well as Polish Romani, in order to liberate the police forces who were needed to transport other inmates to concentration camps from ghettos. And finally, the necessity of solving the problem of Romanian inmates in KL Auschwitz. There was a question what to do with them, and the order was taken. As a result, we basically have a very pessimistic conclusion, namely the genocide on Romani people was performed according to a pattern that is just much more probable than the intentionalistic vision of Holocaust that dominated in literature. That intentionalistic vision said that there's Hitler who gives an order and then everyone is following the order. Why that vision was not true? Why this pattern is most probable, the one that I presented? Well, because why is it pessimistic? Well, because it can be repeated, it can happen. Raphael Lemkin, a person of a great heart, who was a lawyer, he created the definition of genocide, but he was not a sociologist, and he didn't take into account the fact that genocide does not take place like this. The genocide does not take place according to his definition. Of course, his genocide definition was very important when it comes to persecution of genocide. But it does not take into account sociology. Right now, after a period of silence when it comes to extermination of the Romani, more or less from the 60s, the memory of the Romani extermination takes more and more vital place in the activities of international Romani movement. They are trying to build a new story, new identity. They're trying to build a story of the Romani people, as a people who were sentenced to death. Indeed, some of the Romani people were exterminated. Some of them were at risk of extermination, and had Hitler been successful, I guess sooner or later all Romani would have been murdered. Such an identity policy makes the extermination experience an important factor in building the Romani's experience as such. We call it a prosthetic memory. This is a factor of building Romanian bonds that are far superior than bonds within a group. Talking, for instance, about the Romani from Spain, they do attend the anniversaries, they participate in educational programs. Why? Because they feel solidarity with other Romani who experienced extermination. Hence, for the Spanish Romani, it becomes a prosthetic memory. This is how the image of the Romani changes. More and more frequently, we can say that this is a people defined in historic framework, so as a nation that I mentioned in my monography on the Romani, on the memory of the Romani people. That's all from me. I'm very sorry to have gone over time. Thank you. Professor, thank you so very much indeed for the very interesting presentation. The subject is very broad, so thank you very much to present it in such a cohesive way. In a limited time, you pointed out a lot of important problems related to the subject, including the problem related to historical sources and certain problems when it comes to determining the number of victims and the discrepancies, even among historians. As a result, as you mentioned, we have problems with establishing the number. Also, stemming from the fact that some of the Romani people were exterminated in the camps, but some were murdered in mass executions, as you mentioned. Thank you very much again for presentation. Now a few minutes of a break. Let's reconvene at 5. Thank you and enjoy the webinar. Thank you. Thank you.